In a sterile courtroom, an old man stood with shoulders bent by decades of service, his worn uniform jacket hanging loose on his frail frame. He had no attorney, no family present, only his faded military medals and wounded pride. The judge sneered at his sacrifice, mocking his pain with cruel laughter. But he didn't know that behind those heavy doors 40 engines of justice were already rumbling to life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gavel struck the wooden block with the finality of a gunshot, echoing through the Montgomery County Courthouse. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. At the defendant's table sat Sam Hartwell, a 74-year-old man whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he clutched a small American flag pin between his fingers. Sam's appearance told the story of a life lived hard but honorably. His grey hair was combed back with military precision, despite the fact that he'd slept in his car the night before. The navy blue jacket he wore was his old dress uniform from Vietnam, now 2 sizes too large for his diminished frame. 3 bronze stars and a purple heart adorned his chest, their metal surfaces dulled by time, but their meaning undiminished. Across from him, Judge Leonard Blackwood adjusted his black robes with theatrical importance. Blackwood was a man who had never served his country, never faced enemy fire, never slept in a foxhole wondering if he'd see another sunrise. His soft hands had never held anything heavier than a law book, and his greatest battle had been climbing the political ladder to his current position of power. The courtroom was sparsely populated this Tuesday morning. A few court clerks shuffled papers near the back, while Mrs. Peterson, the court reporter, sat poised over her stenography machine. In the gallery, a handful of people waited for their own cases to be called, mostly looking bored or anxious, scrolling through their phones. Case number 47B. The People versus Samuel Hartwell, announced Deputy Williams, a middle-aged bailiff who had served in Iraq himself and recognized the medals on Sam's chest. His voice carried a note of respect that would soon be absent from the proceedings. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, surveying Sam with undisguised disdain. To him, the elderly veteran looked like nothing more than another vagrant clogging up his docket. The charges were simple: disturbing the peace and public intoxication. What the paperwork didn't mention was that Sam had been having nightmares again, the kind that came back around the anniversary of Firebase Delta, where his unit had been overrun and he'd lost so many good men. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Blackwood began, his voice dripping with condescension, "it says here you were found by police at 2 a.m. outside the Veterans Memorial, shouting at, let me see, Charlie in the Wire. Would you care to explain this bizarre behavior to the court?" Sam's jaw tightened. He'd been reliving that terrible night in 1969 when the North Vietnamese had broken through their perimeter. In his nightmare-addled state, he'd driven to the memorial where his friends' names were etched in stone, trying to warn them of the approaching danger that existed only in his traumatized mind. "Your Honor," Sam said quietly, his voice still carrying the authority of a man who had once led soldiers into battle, "I was having a difficult night. Sometimes the memories come back strong. I meant no harm to anyone." Judge Blackwood's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Ah, yes. The old soldier's excuse. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, how many times are we going to see you in here, disrupting our peaceful community with your games?" A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even they could sense the disrespect in the judge's tone. Deputy Williams frowned from his position near the door, his hand unconsciously moving to touch his own service ribbon on his uniform. "This is my first time in court, sir," Sam replied with dignity and tact. "I served 3 tours in Vietnam. I've never been in trouble with the law before." 3 tours, Blackwood repeated mockingly. "How impressive. And what exactly did that accomplish for our great nation, Mr. Hartwell? From where I sit, it looks like it produced nothing but a disturbed old man who can't tell the difference between 1969 and today." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. His hands began to shake more noticeably, but not from age, from a combination of rage and heartbreak. This man in his expensive robes was mocking not just Sam, but every soldier who had answered their country's call. Sam thought of his late wife, Rose, who had waited for him through those 3 deployments, who had held him when the nightmares first started, who had loved him despite the invisible wounds he carried. She'd been gone 2 years now, and without her steady presence, the demons of his past had grown stronger. He thought of his old unit, boys who had become men in the jungles of Southeast Asia, who had bled and died for their country. Men like Corporal Jake Rivera, who had thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad. Rivera had been 19 years old. With a pregnant girlfriend back home, he would never meet. "Your Honor," Sam said, his voice growing stronger, "I may be old and I may have bad dreams, but I served my country with honor. Those weren't war games that brought me to that memorial. That was grief for friends who never made it home." Judge Blackwood waved his hand dismissively. "Spare me the patriotic speeches, Mr. Hartwell. This court deals in facts, not feelings. The fact is you disturbed the peace. The fact is you were intoxicated in public. The fact is you're wasting taxpayers' money with your theatrics." The judge leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malicious pleasure. "Tell me, what makes you think your so-called service entitles you to special treatment? This isn't 1969, old man. No one cares about your jungle adventures anymore." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the clerks looked up from their papers, shocked by the judge's cruelty. Deputy Williams took a step forward, his face flushed with anger, but his position prevented him from speaking out. Sam felt tears threatening to fill his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of this man who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. He straightened his shoulders as much as his arthritic spine would allow and looked Judge Blackwood directly in the eye. "My service doesn't entitle me to special treatment, Your Honor," Sam said with quiet dignity. "It entitles me to basic human respect, something you seem to have forgotten how to give." Outside the courthouse, unbeknownst to anyone inside, the rumble of motorcycle engines began to build. The sound started low and distant, like thunder on the horizon. But it was growing closer, and with each passing minute, more engines joined the chorus. The sound would have meant nothing to Judge Blackwood, who lived in a world of legal briefs and political connections. But if Sam had heard it, if he had known what was coming, he might have recognized something familiar in that mechanical thunder. The sound of brotherhood, of loyalty forged in fire, of debts being repaid. 43 years earlier, in a place called Firebase Delta, a young sergeant named Sam Hartwell had made a decision that saved a life. The boy he saved had grown into a man, had taken a different path than most, had found his family among riders of steel and chrome. And that man had never forgotten the debt he owed to an old soldier who had given him a second chance at life. But for now, Sam stood alone in the courtroom, facing the contempt of a man who had never understood the weight of sacrifice, never felt the brotherhood of warriors, never learned that some debts can never be repaid, only honored. Judge Blackwood's cruel smile widened as he sensed Sam's emotional vulnerability. Like a predator that had caught the scent of wounded prey, he leaned forward in his chair, ready to deliver another blow. The courtroom had grown uncomfortably silent, save for the soft scratching of Mrs. Peterson's stenography machine, capturing every cruel word for posterity. "Basic human respect," the judge repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How noble. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, where was that respect when you were stumbling around our memorial like a drunk vagrant at 2 a.m? Where was that dignity when you were screaming at ghosts?" The few spectators in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman in the 3rd row clutched her purse tighter, while a young man in a business suit looked down at his phone, unable to meet Sam's eyes. They could all sense that something terrible was happening, but none had the courage to speak up against the judge's authority. Sam's fingers tightened around his small American flag pin until the metal edges bit into his palm. The pain helped ground him, helped keep him from drifting back to that horrible night 2 weeks ago, when the anniversary of Firebase Delta had hit him like a freight train. He had been doing so well, or at least he thought he had been. But grief has its own timeline, and trauma follows no calendar. "Your Honor," Sam began again, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I lost control that night. I admit it. But I've never been in trouble before, and I—" "Lost control," Judge Blackwood interrupted, with a theatrical laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "Is that what we're calling it? Ladies and gentlemen of the gallery, this man lost control and decided to reenact the Vietnam War in our city center. Should we all just accept this behavior because he has some old medals pinned to his jacket?" Deputy Williams clenched his jaw so tight his teeth ached. He had seen real combat in Iraq, had lost friends to IEDs and enemy fire. He knew the look in Sam's eyes, the haunted expression of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and was trying desperately to carry on with dignity intact. The deputy's hand moved unconsciously to his radio, though he wasn't sure why. Sam's mind drifted back to that terrible night, despite his efforts to stay present. He had been in his small apartment, the one-bedroom unit in a run-down complex that was all he could afford on his meager pension. Rose's photograph smiled at him from the nightstand. Forever frozen at age 67, her grey hair perfectly styled for church, her eyes full of the love that had sustained him through decades of nightmares. The anniversary always brought them back, the memories he had tried so hard to bury. Firebase Delta, March 15th, 1969. The night the North Vietnamese had overrun their position. The night he had watched 18-year-old boys die in the mud, calling for their mothers with their last breaths. The night he had carried Marcus "Steele" Donovan, then just a scared kid from Detroit, through enemy fire to the medical evac, both of them covered in the blood of their fallen brothers. That night 2 weeks ago, the nightmares had been so vivid, Sam could smell the cordite and jungle rot. He had awakened screaming Rose's name, forgetting for a moment that she was gone, that there was no one left to hold him when the darkness came. In his confused state, still half lost in 1969, he had driven to the Veterans Memorial, needing to warn his dead friends about the attack that was coming. The attack that had already happened 54 years ago. The police had found him there at 2 a.m., sobbing at the black granite wall, his arthritic knees bleeding from where he had fallen while trying to climb over the low fence. In his mind, he was trying to reach the firebase perimeter to warn his sleeping comrades. In reality, he was an old man, having a breakdown in front of a memorial that bore the names of friends who would never age, never grow old, never face the indignity of being mocked in a courtroom. "I was mourning my friends." "Your Honor," Sam said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Men who died for this country. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or cause trouble. I miss them, and I miss my wife. Sometimes the past feels more real than the present." Judge Blackwood's expression grew even more contemptuous. "Oh, please, are we supposed to feel sorry for you now? This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that's wrong with our society. Everyone's a victim. Everyone has an excuse. What's next? Are you going to tell me about your difficult childhood?" The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Even the court clerk, a woman who had seen Judge Blackwood's harsh demeanor for years, looked shocked. Mrs. Peterson's fingers hesitated over her stenography machine, as if she didn't want to record such heartless words. Sam had indeed had a difficult childhood. He had grown up in poverty in rural Kentucky, the son of a coal miner who died of black lung when Sam was 16. He had joined the army not out of patriotism, but out of necessity. It was his only path out of the poverty that had claimed his father. But Vietnam had changed him, had shown him what it meant to serve something greater than himself, to protect the men beside him even when the cause seemed unclear. When he came home in 1970, he had carried the invisible wounds that would haunt him for decades. But he had also carried something else, the knowledge of what real brotherhood looked like, what it meant to have someone willing to die for you and to be willing to die for them in return. He had found that love again with Rose, had built a quiet life as a mechanic, had tried to give back to his community in small ways. "Your Honor," Sam said, straightening his shoulders as much as his old bones would allow, "I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for the same consideration you would show any citizen who made a mistake and is trying to make it right. I'll pay whatever fine you think is fair. I'll do community service. I'll get counseling if that's what you require. But I won't let you dishonor my service or the memory of the men I served with." The judge's face reddened with anger. "Dishonor your service? You dishonored it yourself when you turned into a public nuisance. You want to talk about the men you served with? What do you think they would say if they could see you now, a broken-down old man, disturbing the peace, crying at monuments like some kind of—" Outside, the rumble of engines grew noticeably louder. The sound rolled across the courthouse square like distant thunder, causing a few people in the gallery to glance toward the tall windows. But Judge Blackwood was too focused on his cruel performance to notice, too intoxicated by his power to realize that something was stirring beyond the walls of his domain. Deputy Williams, however, did notice. His radio crackled softly with chatter from the officers stationed outside the building. Words like motorcycles and large group filtered through the static. His eyes moved from Sam, this dignified old warrior being humiliated, to the windows where shadows seemed to be moving in the bright morning sunlight. Sam closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself, trying to find the strength that had gotten him through 3 tours in hell. When he opened them again, they held a quiet dignity that no amount of judicial cruelty could diminish. "They would say that I never gave up," Sam replied softly. "They would say that I kept fighting, even when the fight moved from the battlefield to the struggle just to survive with honor. They would say that I loved my country and my brothers enough to carry their memory, even when it hurt." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and for just a moment, Judge Blackwood's smugness flickered. But only for a moment. Judge Blackwood recovered quickly from his momentary hesitation, his face twisting into an expression of pure disdain. The brief flicker of uncertainty was replaced by an even more vicious determination to break this old man's spirit completely. He had built his reputation on crushing those who dared to show dignity in his courtroom, and he wasn't about to let some washed-up soldier make him look weak. "Honor," the judge spat, practically rolling the word around in his mouth like something distasteful. "You talk about honor while you stumble around drunk, screaming at pieces of stone. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, what's honorable about terrifying families who were trying to enjoy a peaceful evening at our memorial park?" Sam's weathered hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort it took to contain his rising anger. Every word from this pampered man's mouth was like salt in wounds that had never fully healed. But Sam had learned long ago how to endure pain, physical, emotional, and spiritual. The crucible of war had taught him that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to break. "Your Honor," Sam began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I understand that my actions that night were inappropriate, but I was not drunk. I was grieving. There's a difference, though I suppose someone who has never lost brothers in combat might not understand that distinction." The words carried a quiet power that seemed to resonate through the courtroom. Even the spectators in the gallery, who had been avoiding eye contact with the proceedings, looked up. There was something in Sam's tone, not defiance exactly, but an unshakable core of truth that no amount of judicial bullying could touch. Judge Blackwood's face flushed red. "Don't you dare lecture me about loss, old man. And don't think your military service gives you license to—" "It doesn't give me license to do anything," Sam interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "It gave me the privilege of serving alongside heroes, boys who became men in the span of heartbeats, men who died so that people like you could sit in comfortable chairs and pass judgment on those less fortunate." The judge's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No one had ever spoken to him like this in his own courtroom. His power, his authority, his ability to intimidate, it was all built on people's fear of consequences. But what consequences could frighten a man who had already survived hell? As Sam spoke, his mind drifted back across the decades to a sweltering jungle in Southeast Asia. March 15th, 1969. Firebase Delta had been nothing more than a clearing in the dense vegetation, surrounded by sandbags, razor wire, and the constant fear of death. Sam had been a staff sergeant then, 24 years old, and already an old man by war standards, responsible for a squad of teenagers who looked to him for leadership and hope in equal measure. Among those young faces was Private Marcus Donovan, barely 18, with scared eyes and hands that shook every time the mortars fell. Marcus was from Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress, raised on streets where survival meant being tough. But the jungle was different. Here, all the street smarts in the world couldn't protect you from an enemy that moved like shadows and struck without warning. The other soldiers had nicknamed Marcus Steel as a joke. He was anything but. He flinched at every sound, jumped at shadows, and spent most of his first month in-country fighting back tears when he thought no one was looking. The veteran soldiers whispered that he wouldn't last a week, that he'd crack under pressure and get someone killed. But Sam had seen something different in the frightened boy from Detroit. Beneath the fear, there was a loyalty that ran bone deep. Marcus would share his last cigarette with a buddy, would volunteer for the most dangerous patrols if it meant keeping his friends safer, would stay awake on watch even when exhaustion made his eyes burn. Fear didn't make him a coward, it made him careful, and careful soldiers lived longer. The night of March 15th had started like so many others. The humid air was thick with the smell of jungle rot and diesel fuel. Sam had been making his rounds, checking on his men, when the first mortar rounds screamed overhead. Then came the small arms fire, the distinctive crack of AK-47s cutting through the night air like deadly exclamation points. Contact left. Contact left! The shouts echoed across the firebase as tracers cut through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The North Vietnamese had come in force, their attack coordinated and brutal. Within minutes, the perimeter was breached in 3 places. Marcus had been manning a machine gun position on the firebase's eastern edge when the assault began. Sam could still remember the sound of that M60. Its steady rhythm suddenly interrupted by silence. Through the chaos and smoke, he had seen Marcus stumble backward from his position, clutching his shoulder where shrapnel had torn through his flak jacket. "Medic!" Marcus had screamed, but not for himself. His gun crew had taken the full brunt of a mortar round. 2 were dead, 1 was dying, and Marcus was trying desperately to drag his wounded loader to safety while enemy soldiers poured through the gap in their defenses. Sam had made a decision in that split second that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it was wrong, but because of all the other decisions he couldn't make, all the other soldiers he couldn't save. He had abandoned his position and sprinted through enemy fire to Marcus's gun emplacement. What he found there was a boy who had become a man in the space of heartbeats. Marcus, bleeding from 3 wounds, was still manning his machine gun, laying down covering fire for the wounded men around him. His face was streaked with tears and cordite, but his hands were steady on the weapon. "Sarge," Marcus had shouted over the din of battle. "I can't leave them. I can't leave my guys." That was the moment Sam knew the frightened kid from Detroit had found his steel. Not the kind that makes you fearless, but the kind that makes you do what's right, even when you're terrified. Together, they had held that position for 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, fighting off wave after wave of attackers while the wounded were evacuated. When the position finally became untenable, Sam had grabbed Marcus and what remained of their equipment and fought their way back to the inner perimeter. By dawn, when the enemy finally withdrew, Firebase Delta was scarred and bloody, but it stood. 18 men died that night, but 43 lived, including Marcus Donovan, in the aftermath as they sat in the smoking ruins of their firebase. Marcus had looked at Sam with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, a bond forged in fire that would never break. "Sarge," Marcus had said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing smoke. "I don't know how to thank you for not giving up on me." Sam had clapped the young soldier on the shoulder, feeling proud of what the boy had become. "You don't thank me, son. You live a good life. You remember what we fought for here. And if you ever meet another scared kid who needs someone to believe in him, you be that someone." Now, 54 years later, Sam stood in a different kind of battlefield, facing a different kind of enemy. But the core of who he was, the man who had refused to abandon a frightened boy in a jungle hell, remained unchanged. The rumble outside had grown so loud that even Judge Blackwood couldn't ignore it anymore. The windows of the courtroom actually vibrated with the sound of dozens of motorcycle engines. Deputy Williams was speaking quietly into his radio, his eyes moving between Sam and the doors. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel, trying to regain control of the moment. "I don't care what sob story you think you're telling, Mr. Hartwell. This court will not be swayed by—" The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Just a crack at first, letting in a sliver of bright morning light. And with that light came the sound of footsteps, heavy boots on marble moving with military precision. Sam's heart stopped as he recognized the silhouette in the doorway. The man who stepped through the courtroom doors was a far cry from the frightened 18-year-old who had trembled in a Vietnamese jungle 54 years ago. Marcus "Steele" Donovan now stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders filling out a black leather jacket adorned with patches that told the story of decades on the road. His beard was streaked with silver, his hands scarred from years of working on engines and living hard. But his eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked to Sam for guidance in the hell of Firebase Delta. Steele's presence commanded immediate attention. The soft conversations in the gallery died instantly, replaced by an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air. His boots echoed against the marble floor with each deliberate step as he moved down the center aisle, his gaze fixed not on Judge Blackwood, but on the frail figure of Sam Hartwell standing at the defendant's table. "Marcus," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible even in the sudden silence. 54 years collapsed into nothing. The old sergeant saw past the leather and scars to the scared kid who had found his courage when it mattered most. Steele nodded once, slow and solemn, his eyes never leaving Sam's face. "Hello, Sarge," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and road dust, but carrying the same respect it had held in 1969. "Been a long time." Judge Blackwood's mouth fell open. This was not how his courtroom operated. People didn't simply walk in during proceedings, didn't interrupt his authority with their mere presence. He slammed his gavel against its block, the sharp crack echoing off the walls. "Excuse me. This is a court of law, not a biker rally. Remove this man immediately." The judge's voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the first hint of uncertainty he had shown all morning. Deputy Williams shifted uncomfortably near the door, his hand moving toward his radio. But something in Steele's bearing, the military precision in his posture, the controlled way he moved, made the deputy hesitate. This wasn't some random troublemaker. This was a man with purpose. "I'm not causing any trouble, Your Honor," Steele said without taking his eyes off Sam. "I'm here to witness." That's allowed, isn't it? Behind him, the courtroom doors swung open wider and another figure entered. Then another. And another? Each man and woman wore the same black leather, the same patches, the same expression of quiet determination. They filed in with military precision, their boots creating a rhythmic thunder on the polished floor. The spectators in the gallery began to shift nervously as row after row of Hell's Angels filled the benches behind them. These weren't the cartoonish bikers of Hollywood movies. These were serious people, many of them veterans themselves, united by bonds of brotherhood and loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Sam's legs nearly gave out beneath him as he watched the procession. He gripped the edge of the defendant's table for support, overwhelmed by the sight of so many people coming to stand with him. In his darkest moments over the past 2 weeks, lying awake in his small apartment, wondering if he was finally losing his mind completely, he had felt utterly alone in the world. Rose was gone, his children lived thousands of miles away and called perhaps twice a year, and the VA counselor he'd been seeing had retired last month. But he wasn't alone. He never had been. Steele took a seat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind Sam. His presence was like a shield, a wall of solidarity that Sam could feel even without turning around. Behind Steele, 39 other riders filled the benches, their collective presence transforming the sterile courtroom into something that felt more like a gathering of warriors. Judge Blackwood's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. He looked around wildly, as if expecting courthouse security to materialize and restore his sense of control. But Deputy Williams remained motionless by the door, and the court clerk and stenographer sat frozen at their stations, uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. This is highly irregular. The judge sputtered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. I will not have my courtroom invaded by what, Your Honor? Steele's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced down worse things than angry judges. By citizens exercising their right to observe public proceedings. By veterans showing respect for one of their own. The word veterans hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. As Steele spoke, several of the riders behind him shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of military tattoos, service patches sewn discreetly onto their jackets, and the unmistakable bearing of men and women who had served their country in various conflicts over the decades. Mrs. Peterson, the court stenographer, found herself typing faster than she ever had, trying to capture not just the words being spoken, but the electric atmosphere that had transformed her familiar workplace. She had worked in this courtroom for 15 years and had never seen anything like it. Sam slowly turned to look at the sea of faces behind him. Some were familiar, men he recognized from the local VA hospital, others from the motorcycle gatherings that raised money for wounded veterans. But many were strangers who had come simply because Steele had asked them to, because one old soldier needed their support. I don't understand, Sam said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. How did you— Word travels fast in our community, Sarge, Steele replied. When we heard what was happening to you, when we heard how you were being treated, he gestured toward Judge Blackwood with barely concealed contempt. Well, we remembered what you taught us about not abandoning our brothers. The judge tried once more to assert his authority. I don't care if you're veterans or the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This behavior is intimidating, and I won't— Intimidating. The voice came from a woman in the third row, her grey hair pulled back in a neat bun, her leather jacket bearing the patch of a Navy veteran. The only intimidation I see here is a judge mocking an old soldier's pain. A murmur of agreement rippled through the riders. Not loud, not threatening, just the sound of people who had seen enough injustice and weren't willing to stay silent anymore. Judge Blackwood looked around desperately, his eyes finally landing on Deputy Williams. Officer! Clear this courtroom immediately. The deputy straightened but didn't move. His own service ribbon caught the light as he spoke carefully. Sir, they're not disrupting the proceedings. They have a right to observe. The balance of power in the courtroom had shifted so completely that even the original spectators, the ones who had been content to watch an old man be humiliated, now sat in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed, others frightened, and a few seemed to be seeing Sam Hartwell clearly for the first time. Steele leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the bench in front of him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Your Honor, the man standing at that table saved my life 54 years ago, not just from enemy bullets, but from giving up on myself. He saw something in me when I couldn't see it myself. He believed in me when no one else did. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. So, when I heard that same man was being mocked and humiliated in a courtroom, when I heard he was being treated like garbage by someone who never served a day in his life, well, we decided it was time to return the favor. The courtroom fell into complete silence, except for the soft whir of the ventilation system and the distant sound of more motorcycles arriving outside. Judge Blackwood sat frozen in his high-backed chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning realization that he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Sam felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of grief or shame. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of the overwhelming relief that comes from realizing you're not facing the darkness alone. The frightened boy from Detroit had grown into a man who kept his promises. Judge Blackwood sat in his leather chair like a king whose kingdom was crumbling beneath him. The gavel in his hand, once a symbol of absolute authority, now felt as heavy and useless as a paperweight. 40 pairs of eyes stared at him with barely concealed contempt, and for the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. The courtroom doors opened again, but this time it wasn't more bikers entering. A young woman with a press badge hurried in, her camera equipment jangling as she tried to find a seat in the packed gallery. Then another reporter and another. News traveled fast in the digital age, and word of the Hells Angels' arrival at Montgomery County Courthouse was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Veteran justice was trending on Twitter. Facebook posts were being shared by the thousands. Local news vans were pulling up outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. The story was no longer contained within these marble walls. It belonged to the world now. Steele noticed the media arrival with satisfaction. He had learned long ago that sunlight was the best disinfectant for corruption, and Judge Blackwood's cruelty would no longer hide in the shadows of a quiet courtroom. The man who had built his reputation on humiliating those who couldn't fight back was about to discover what accountability looked like. "Looks like you've got an audience now." "Judge," Steele said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a friendly observation. "Hope you're ready for your close-up." The judge's face went through another series of color changes, red with anger, white with fear, then a sickly green as the implications hit him. His entire career had been built on operating in obscurity, making his cruel jokes to small audiences who were too intimidated or too powerless to challenge him. But now, camera lenses were focusing on him, recording his every expression for posterity. Sam turned slowly to face the packed gallery, overwhelmed by the show of support. He recognized some faces from the local American Legion post, others from the VA hospital, where he went for his checkups. But many were strangers, bikers who had never met him, but had come because Steele had asked, because the Brotherhood demanded it, because some things were more important than convenience. "I don't understand," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would all of you do this for me?" A voice from the back row answered him. "Because you're one of us, brother." The speaker was a grizzled man with a prosthetic leg visible beneath his jeans. "Doesn't matter if we've met before. Doesn't matter what branch you served in or what war you fought. When they come for one of us, they come for all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the leather-clad crowd. These weren't just bikers, they were a tribe, bound together by shared values that civilian society often forgot: loyalty, honor, and the understanding that some debts could never be fully repaid, only honored. Judge Blackwood tried desperately to regain control of the situation. He slammed his gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing off the walls like gunshots. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom. These proceedings will not be turned into a circus." But his words fell flat. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that his authority seemed almost quaint, like a child demanding respect from adults who had outgrown his tantrums. Steele stood slowly, his imposing frame unfolding to its full height. The simple motion commanded immediate attention. Even the reporters stopped their frantic note-taking to focus on him. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtroom with the authority of a man who had earned his respect the hard way. "Your Honor," he began, and the title dripped with irony. "You wanted to know about accountability, about respect. about what this old soldier has contributed to society." He gestured towards Sam with reverence. "Let me tell you a story about contribution." Judge Blackwood opened his mouth to object, but Steele continued before he could speak. 54 years ago, this man saved my life. Not just from enemy bullets, though he did that too, but from giving up on myself. I was 18 years old, scared out of my mind, convinced I was going to die in some jungle on the other side of the world. My own squad thought I was worthless. Hell, I thought I was worthless. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the soft whir of camera motors capturing every word. But Sergeant Hartwell saw something different. When Firebase Delta was overrun, when the shit hit the fan, pardon my language, Your Honor, he didn't abandon me. He could have, would have been the smart, tactical decision. Save the experienced soldiers, let the scared kid figure it out on his own. Steele's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But that's not who he is. He came back for me, fought through enemy fire to get me, stayed with me when our position was hopeless. And when it was over, when we'd somehow survived the worst night of our lives, you know what he told me? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. He told me to live a good life, to remember what we fought for. And if I ever met another scared kid who needed someone to believe in him, to be that someone. Steele's eyes moved from Sam to the judge, his gaze hardening. I've spent 40 years trying to live up to that advice, building a brotherhood, helping veterans who fell through the cracks, being there for people when the system failed them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So don't you dare, Steele continued, his voice rising, don't you dare sit there in your comfortable chair and mock this man's sacrifice. Don't you dare question his contribution to society. This man taught me what it means to have honor, what it means to stand by your brothers, what it means to never give up on someone just because they're scared or broken or lost. The reporters were scribbling frantically, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts and shared across social media for days to come. Judge Blackwood looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the nightmare his morning had become. The original spectators, the ones who had chuckled at his cruel jokes, now avoided his gaze entirely. The court staff sat frozen at their stations, uncertain whether to continue with normal procedures or wait for this unprecedented situation to resolve itself. Deputy Williams, still stationed by the door, found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the only official authority figure who retained any credibility. His radio crackled softly with updates from the officers outside. More bikers were still arriving, along with news vans, curious civilians, and what sounded like a growing crowd of supporters. "Officer Williams," the judge said, his voice cracking slightly, "I order you to clear this courtroom of these intruders." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had lost friends to IEDs and enemy fire. He knew what it looked like when brothers stood together, and he knew what it looked like when authority was abused. His duty was to maintain order, but his conscience told him that sometimes order came from doing what was right. "Not what was commanded, sir," Deputy Williams said carefully. "They're not disrupting the proceedings. They're exercising their right to observe public court sessions. As long as they remain peaceful." The judge sputtered. "This is intimidation. This is justice," said a clear voice from the gallery. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Mrs. Chen, an elderly Asian woman in the 4th row, her small frame almost lost among the leather jackets surrounding her. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a small American flag, the kind given to families at military funerals. "My husband served with men like Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious nervousness. "He always said the worst thing about coming home wasn't the nightmares or the wounds. It was how people looked through you, like your service didn't matter, like you were invisible." She stood slowly, her aged joints protesting the movement. I've been sitting in this courtroom for 20 minutes, listening to you mock this man's pain, and I'm ashamed. Ashamed that I didn't speak up sooner. Ashamed that it took these bikers to show me what courage looks like." Her words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. It was a civilian, someone with no connection to the Hell's Angels or their intimidating presence, validating everything Steele had said. The moral authority of the moment shifted even further away from Judge Blackwood. Sam wiped tears from his eyes with the back of his hand. For months, he had felt like a ghost haunting the edges of society, invisible, unwanted, forgotten. But now, surrounded by this unlikely army of leather and steel, validated by strangers who recognized his worth, he began to remember who he used to be. The broken old man who had entered the courtroom that morning was still there, still carried the wounds and sorrows that time couldn't heal. But something else was awakening. The soldier who had never learned to quit. The sergeant who had led men through hell and brought them home alive. Judge Blackwood realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he was no longer in control of his own courtroom. The silence that followed Mrs. Chen's words was deafening. Judge Blackwood sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of rage, fear, and something that might have been the dawning recognition of his own moral bankruptcy. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion, every bead of sweat that formed on his brow as he realized his cruelty was being broadcast to the world. Sam Hartwell stood a little straighter, feeling strength flow back into his arthritic spine. The faces surrounding him, leather-clad bikers, fellow veterans, concerned civilians, reminded him of something he had forgotten in the dark months since Rose's death. He had never been just Samuel Hartwell, troubled old man with nightmares. He was Staff Sergeant Samuel Hartwell, United States Army, a man who had led soldiers through hell and brought them home alive. "Your Honor," Sam said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with newfound authority. "You asked me what I've contributed to society. You questioned whether my service entitles me to respect." Judge Blackwood opened his mouth to speak, but Sam continued before he could interrupt. "You're right about one thing. My service doesn't entitle me to special treatment, but it does entitle me to basic human dignity, something you seem to have forgotten how to give." Sam's hands stopped trembling as he spoke. "I served 3 tours in Vietnam. I watched 18-year-old boys die in mud and blood, calling for their mothers with their last breath. I carried wounded men through enemy fire because that's what you do. You don't leave anyone behind." The courtroom was absolutely still. Even the reporters had stopped their frantic scribbling, transfixed by the transformation taking place before their eyes. "When I came home, I didn't demand parades or special privileges. I went back to work, paid my taxes, raised a family, and tried to be a decent man. When my wife Rose was dying of cancer, I held her hand through every treatment, every sleepless night, every moment of pain. When she passed, I buried her with dignity and tried to carry on." Sam's voice grew stronger with each word. "Yes, I have nightmares. Yes, I sometimes get confused and think I'm back in that jungle. Yes, I went to the memorial that night because the pain was too much to bear alone. But that doesn't make me less than human. That doesn't make me worthy of your mockery." Steele watched from the front row, his heart swelling with pride. This was the sergeant he remembered, the man who had stood firm under pressure, who had never backed down from doing what was right. Judge Blackwood finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. This is still my courtroom. I will not be lectured by what?" Steele interrupted, rising to his feet. "By a man who sacrificed his youth for his country. By someone who understands what real honor looks like." The judge's face flushed red. "You think you can intimidate me with your gang? This is still a court of law." "Nobody's intimidating anyone," said a new voice from the back of the room. All heads turned to see District Attorney Patricia Morrison entering the courtroom, flanked by 2 senior prosecutors. Her expression was grim as she surveyed the scene, the packed gallery of bikers, the media presence, and Judge Blackwood's obvious distress. "I've been monitoring the situation," she said. her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been elected to represent justice in the county. The entire proceeding has been live-streamed on social media. My office has received over 300 calls in the past hour from citizens expressing concern about the treatment of Mr. Hartwell. Judge Blackwood's face went white. District Attorney Morrison, this is highly irregular. You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom. I have jurisdiction over every case prosecuted in this county, she replied coolly. And right now, I'm watching a misdemeanor trespassing case being handled in a manner that brings shame to our entire judicial system. She walked to the prosecutor's table, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Your Honor, after reviewing the circumstances of Mr. Hartwell's case and consulting with my staff, the People's Office is dismissing all charges. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective exhale of relief and satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, could still prevail when enough people demanded it. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel frantically. You cannot dismiss charges in my courtroom without my approval. Actually, Your Honor, I can, District Attorney Morrison replied calmly. The charges were filed by my office, and we have prosecutorial discretion to dismiss them when it serves the interests of justice. She turned to address Sam directly. Mr. Hartwell, I want to publicly apologize for how you've been treated today. Your service to our country deserves respect, not ridicule. This case should never have come to trial in the first place. Steele stepped forward, his hand on Sam's shoulder. What about him? He asked, nodding toward the judge. What happens to someone who abuses their power like this? District Attorney Morrison's expression grew even more serious. That's not my decision to make. But I can tell you that the State Judicial Commission will be receiving a formal complaint about today's proceedings. The voters of this county will ultimately decide whether Judge Blackwood deserves to keep his position. The judge sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his career was likely over. The video footage of his cruel treatment of a veteran would be played endlessly on news channels and social media. His name would become synonymous with judicial abuse of power. The comfortable life he had built on the foundation of others' misery was crumbling beneath him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to over 200 people. Veterans from 3 counties had driven in when word spread through the tight-knit military community. Local citizens who had seen the live streams began arriving to show their support. Even some of Judge Blackwood's former victims had come forward, ready to share their own stories of his cruelty. Sam looked around the courtroom one last time, taking in the faces of all the people who had stood with him. 6 hours ago, he had felt utterly alone in the world. Now he was surrounded by a brotherhood that stretched far beyond blood relations or shared experiences. Case dismissed. District Attorney Morrison announced officially. The gavel that had been used as a weapon of humiliation all morning finally served its proper purpose. But it wasn't Judge Blackwood who struck it. His hands were shaking too badly to function. Instead, Deputy Williams stepped forward and brought the gavel down with finality. "This court is adjourned," the deputy said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had finally seen justice served. As the crowd began to file out of the courtroom, Steele remained beside Sam, just as he had stayed beside him that terrible night at Firebase Delta. Some bonds, once forged in fire, could never be broken. "So what now, Sarge?" Steele asked, using the old nickname that carried decades of respect and affection. Sam smiled for the first time in months, a real smile that reached his eyes and reminded everyone present that beneath the pain and grief, the man who had led soldiers through hell was still very much alive. "Now," Sam said, his voice strong and clear, "we remember why we served. We remember what we fought for. And we make sure no other veteran stands alone when the darkness comes." The broken old man who had entered the courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by the soldier who had never learned how to quit. The sergeant who knew that the most important battles weren't always fought with weapons. And the human being who understood that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to let cruelty have the last word. The courthouse steps had been transformed into something resembling a victory celebration, mixed with a military reunion. Over 200 motorcycles lined the street, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun like a river of steel and defiance. Veterans from every branch of service mingled with bikers, local citizens and reporters, all united by the shared experience of witnessing justice served and cruelty defeated. Sam emerged from the building flanked by Steele and a dozen Hell's Angels. But he wasn't the same broken man who had climbed these steps that morning in shame. His shoulders were square, his head high, and though tears still streamed down his weathered cheeks, they were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation. The crowd erupted in cheers when they saw him. American flags waved in the breeze, motorcycle engines revved in salute, and the chant of Semper Fi and Hooah echoed off the courthouse walls. For perhaps the first time since Rose's funeral, Sam felt truly seen, truly valued, truly home. Speech, speech. Someone called from the crowd, and the chant was taken up by dozens of voices. Sam looked around at the sea of faces. Leather-clad bikers with tears in their eyes, elderly veterans in wheelchairs holding small American flags, young soldiers still in uniform who had driven hours to be here, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by his story. He raised a trembling hand, and the crowd fell silent. "I don't know what to say," Sam began, his voice carrying across the square despite its softness. "This morning I woke up thinking I was alone in the world. I thought I was just a broken old man who had outlived his usefulness, who had become a burden on society." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his emotions. Steele stood beside him like a guardian, ready to catch him if he stumbled, just as Sam had been ready to catch him in that jungle so many years ago. "But you've all reminded me of something I had forgotten," Sam continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not alone. None of us are alone. When Rose was dying, she made me promise to keep living, to keep fighting, to remember that my life had meaning. I thought I had broken that promise, but now I see that I just forgot how to recognize family when it wasn't blood-related." The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. "Steele, Marcus, you've grown into the man I always knew you could become. But more than that, you've built something beautiful here. A brotherhood that doesn't abandon its own, that stands up to bullies, that remembers what honor really means." Sam's voice cracked with emotion. "You kept the promise you made to that scared kid in the jungle. You've been there for people when they needed someone to believe in them." Steele wiped his eyes with the back of his leather glove, not caring who saw. Around them, hardened bikers and tough veterans were openly weeping, moved by the sight of two warriors whose bond had survived half a century. A young Marine in dress blues stepped forward from the crowd. "Sir, I wanted to thank you, not just for your service, but for showing us what it looks like to keep your dignity even when the world tries to take it away. You stood your ground in there when it would have been easier to just take the punishment and disappear." Sam reached out and shook the young Marine's hand. "Son, I've learned that sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't against foreign enemies. Sometimes they're against the voices that tell us we don't matter anymore, that we're forgotten, that we're worthless. Today, all of you helped me win that battle." An older woman pushed through the crowd, clutching a folded American flag to her chest. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "this was my husband's flag. He died in Vietnam in 1968. I've carried it with me for 55 years, and I want you to have it. You and men like you gave everything so that flag would still wave free." Sam accepted the flag with reverence, holding it against his chest as if it were a sacred relic. "Ma'am, I can't take this. This belongs to your family." "You are family," she replied firmly. "Every veteran is family, and family takes care of family." The ceremony that followed was spontaneous and beautiful. One by one, people came forward to thank Sam, to share their own stories, to offer support. Phone numbers were exchanged, invitations were extended, and a network of care was woven around the old soldier who had started the day feeling invisible. District Attorney Morrison approached with a small group of officials. Mr. Hartwell, she said, I want you to know that our office is establishing a veterans advocacy program. We're partnering with local veterans organizations to ensure that no veteran is ever treated the way you were today. Would you be willing to help us develop this program? Sam looked surprised. Me? I'm just an old soldier with bad dreams. No, sir, Steele interjected with a grin. You're a survivor, a leader, and a man who just reminded this entire city what real strength looks like. I'd say you're exactly what they need. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin, but not before plans were made. There would be regular motorcycle rides to visit hospitalized veterans. There would be fundraisers for homeless vets. There would be a support network that would ensure no veteran ever felt as alone as Sam had felt. Steele approached his old sergeant as the sun began to set. Ready for one last ride, Sarge? Sam looked at the motorcycle, then at the man who had once been a frightened boy in a Vietnamese jungle. I haven't been on a bike in 40 years. Time to remember how it feels to fly, Steele said with a smile. Sam climbed onto the back of Steele's Harley, accepting the helmet that was offered. As the engine roared to life beneath them, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Rose died. Hope. The procession that left the courthouse was majestic. 40 Hell's Angels motorcycles escorted Sam through the city, their engines thundering in harmony like a mechanical symphony of respect. American flags flew from handlebars, and the setting sun painted everything in gold. As they rode, Sam closed his eyes and felt the wind on his face. He thought of Rose, and for the first time since her death, the memory didn't bring pain. Instead, it brought peace. He had kept his promise to her after all. He had kept living, kept fighting, and had rediscovered the meaning that had always been there, in service, in brotherhood, in the simple act of standing up for what's right. They stopped at the Iron Horse Diner, where Eddie Kowalski had prepared a feast fit for heroes. The long tables were filled with veterans, bikers and new friends sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of camaraderie that can only come from people who truly understand each other. As the evening drew to a close, Steele stood to address the gathered crowd. 54 years ago, a sergeant in the army taught me that we don't abandon our brothers. Today, we returned that lesson to him when he needed it most. But this isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. He raised his beer in a toast. To Staff Sergeant Samuel Hartwell, the man who taught us that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. It's about standing up for others even when you can barely stand yourself. And it's about never, ever giving up on family. The toast echoed through the diner. To Sarge, Sam stood slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. To all of you, he replied, for reminding an old soldier that the most important victory isn't surviving the war, it's remembering why the war was worth fighting in the first place. As the night wore on and the stories were shared, Sam Hartwell understood that he had found something precious, a tribe, a family, a brotherhood that would ensure he never stood alone again. The nightmares would still come, the grief would still visit, but he would face them surrounded by people who understood that some wounds never fully heal. But that doesn't mean the warrior is broken. Judge Blackwood's career would indeed end in disgrace within the month, his cruel treatment of veterans becoming a cautionary tale told in law schools across the country. But his downfall was not the real victory of that day. The real victory was in the rediscovery of brotherhood, the triumph of dignity over cruelty, and the reminder that in a world that often forgets its heroes, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and I won't be silent anymore." Sam's story became legend in the veterans community, not because of the spectacle or the media attention, but because it proved that no matter how dark things seem, no matter how alone you feel, somewhere there's a brother or sister who remembers your sacrifice and is willing to ride through hell to stand beside you. And in the end, that's what service really means. Not the uniform you wore or the medals you earned, but the bonds you forged and the promise that no one gets left behind, not even 54 years later. Not even when the battle is against despair itself. The brotherhood endures. The promise is kept. The fight continues. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.